Over the years, I've seen a number of attempts to create a timeline for the Fire Emblem series. Being mostly anthological, there isn't a lot tying the game's stories together. Besides anime and dragons, each game pretty much stands on its own. That brings us to the subject of today's video though, the Dragons of Fire Emblem. This will be part 1 of my timeline discussion, so in this video I'll talk about the dragons of the series, then in part 2 I'll use the information discussed here to construct what I believe the timeline to be. If you're interested in watching part 2 when it comes out, make sure to subscribe, and while you're down there, drop a like. That out of the way, let's begin. I'll be going in the order that each game released, skipping over repeats. Before we get into that though, I did want to go over some common elements that most of the dragons in the series share. In every game, there exist Manaketes in some form, or dragons who can take on the form of humans. They're able to transform by either utilizing the power of a dragonstone, or in some cases just able to transform at will. In their human form, they're typically set apart from normal humans by their long lifespans as well as their pointed ears in most cases. Starting with the history of Aranea, we see the series' first dragons. Thousands of years before the events of FE1, the dragon tribes of Aranea existed in relative peace. Soon, however, a genetic disease began to appear more and more, that being degeneration. As such long-lived creatures, dragons reach a certain point where they can no longer think or control themselves. They couldn't reproduce either, and it seemed as though the dragons would become extinct if something wasn't done. As a solution to this problem, Naga, the ruler of the divine dragons, proposed they take on the form of humans, sealing their power in dragonstones. Many accepted this, becoming Manaketes. Others did not, refusing to stoop to the level of the weak humans. What ensued was a long war between those feral, prideful dragons and the alliance of mankind and the Manaketes. In the end, the Manaketes' dragonstones were exhausted, but those degenerated dragons were sealed away in the Dragon's Table. As such, the Golden Age of Dragons ended. These saviors of mankind were revered as gods. They continued to guide humanity, helping them advance and granting them vast knowledge, culminating in the construction of the city of Thebes. Among the people in this city was a man named Fornius. He was a genius alchemist, studying necromancy among other things. At first, his work was supported by the Thebes Senate, which allowed him to attain a small amount of blood of a divine dragon. Mixing it with the blood of a human, he created an infant dragon that would later become known as Grima many thousand years later. Growing concerned about Fornius, the Thebes Senate sent messengers, then soon soldiers, to investigate what was happening, none of whom returned. At this point, news of what was happening in Thebes reached the ears of Duma, a divine dragon and a powerful warrior. Enraged by what he had discovered and fearful of what mankind would do if left to their own devices, he laid siege to Thebes with an army, destroying the city in no more than 3 days. Seeing what Duma had done, Naga became furious, causing a war to break out between her and Duma. Supporting her brother was another divine dragon, Mila, though just after 9 days they could not compete with Naga's might. Defeated, they surrendered, accepting the punishment Naga had for them. Duma and Mila were exiled from Aranea. With them, Naga sent one of her fangs to Valentia, to be used by the humans there to slay Duma and Mila if the need ever arose. The power of Dragon's Fangs is a topic I could go on a whole tangent about, but I'll try to keep it brief here. There are a number of swords forged from fangs in the series, the most notable being the falchions. In addition to this, some of the holy weapons in FE4 are likely dragon fangs, such as the Tyr Fang. FE5 continues the trend with the Loptyr Fang and Bragi Blade. They are left out of the series for a little while, reappearing in 3 houses with the hero's relics, this time being forged from a variety of bones, not just fangs. It appears that, to some degree, these weapons inherit some of the properties of the dragon's power. The Loptyr Fang is a perfect example of this. Anyway, I've ranted long enough, let's go back to the history of the dragons. Having become the divine rulers of Valentia, Duma and Mila had differing outlooks on how the humans should be governed. Their disagreements slowly grew in intensity, culminating in another all-out war. Despite that, the two left Naga's Fang untouched. Eventually, they split the continent, with Duma ruling over the north and Mila the south. As time marched on, the dragon's power waned, so much so that pirates began posing a threat to the continent. Seeing this, Mila and Duma each forged a blood pact with a human of their nation. With the blood of dragons, these 2 humans vanquished the pirates using the King's Fang, now forged falchion. Following this, the 2 would go on to become the first rulers of Rigel and Zofia, respectively. Time for another tangent. These blood pacts are elaborated on a bit more in FE4. By consuming the blood of a dragon, a human, alongside their descendants, become tied to that dragon. They gain enhanced strength and the ability to wield weapons forged from dragons, as we talked about before. In some cases, the blood of any dragon is enough to wield these weapons, but in other games like FE4 it's a little more restrictive. Regardless, once a human bloodline has been tied to a dragon, that dragon can enter a gesh with one of those humans. These geshes allow the dragon to inhabit the body of a human while maintaining their power. It's an effective way around the limitations of becoming a Manakete. We don't see Doom or Mila do this, but we'll see more of it in FE4 and Three Houses. Time continued on, and Rudolf was crowned the 4th Emperor of Rigel. All the while, Duma's sanity began to wane. With the pact his ancestor had made with the dragon, Rudolf could sense this. When he was inevitably commanded to invade Zofia, Rudolf began taking measures to ensure the survival of the people of Valentia. Duma's invasion was inevitable, his mind was lost. Biding his time while he contemplated how he could end the rule of Duma and Mila, he bolstered his army, appealing to Duma. Eventually, he would march on Mila's temple, sealing her power with the falchion. In turn, Mila used the last of her strength to seal the falchion, preventing it from being turned against her brother. I won't recount the events of Grima and Anankos, but as we know, it culminates in Alm killing Duma with the falchion and bringing an end to the dragons of Valentia. Meanwhile, back in Aranea, there was one Earth Dragon who accepted becoming a Manakete, that being Medius. He was entrusted to guard the dragon's table by Naga, where his degenerated brethren were sealed. He did not falter when Duma destroyed Thebes. Following its fall, however, the humans became fearful of the dragons, and seeing what they were capable of, the Manaketes were persecuted. Seeing this, Medius seethed for ages, and as the kingdom of Aranea was founded, his hatred boiled over. He in turn founded the kingdom of Dolhr, uniting the remaining Manaketes. He attacked the kingdoms of man, bringing them to ruin. Once again, however, Naga came to the aid of humanity, granting them one of her fangs, which was forged into another falchion. Using it, the hero Henri slew Medius. Many years later, the dragon was revived by Garneth, leading to a similar attack on humanity before falling to Marth. Once again, in FE3, Medius was revived, though this time the seal on the degenerated dragons had weakened. Ultimately, Medius was slain for the 3rd time, and the seal was restored. Moving on to FE4 and 5, we must once again look at the history of Aranea. During the Great War between the Divine Dragons and the Earth Dragons, a man by the name of Geir made his way from Jugdral to Aranea. Having barely survived, an Earth Dragon by the name of Loptyr encountered the man. Loptyr knew that the Earth Dragons would inevitably lose, and despite his hatred for humanity, he forged a blood pact and entered a gesh with Geir. He sealed his power in the Tome of Loptyr as his body died, allowing Geir to take the book with him back to Jugdral. Through his gesh, Loptyr took control of Geir's body, using him to establish a church in his name, and following that, an empire. With his power, Loptyr hopped from descendant to descendant of Geir, continuing his reign and enacting terror on the humans he so loathed. It wasn't for many generations until Naga became aware of what was happening in Jugdral. Discovering this, alongside 11 other divine dragons, they traveled to the continent to aid its people. The Loptyr Empire controlled the entire continent, save the city of Dana, where a group of rebels held out. The divine dragons descended upon the city, forming a pact with the 12 heroes and granting them powerful weapons, which held the dragons' power. Ultimately, with this help, the now 12 crusaders were able to overthrow the Loptyr Empire. With his vassals slain, Loptyr's spirit returned to the tome. Geir XVII's younger brother Mera was spared by the Crusaders, as he did not possess Major Loptyr blood and thus could not wield the tome or enter a gesh. It wouldn't be for another 700 years until a child with Major Loptyr blood was born, the son of Emperor Arvis, Julius. Seeing this, Manfroy, who had carefully arranged the union of Arvis and Deirdre, gave Julius the Tome of Loptyr, allowing the dragon spirit to take control of the boy. Once again, Jugdral was plunged into chaos as Loptyr reigned. After the Battle of Valhalla, Lewin, a descendant of the Crusaders said, was slain by Manfroy. Having foreseen the events that would come to pass, the Divine Dragon Forseti returned to Jugdral, forming a gesh with Lewin. The dragon would possess his body in a similar manner to Loptyr, allowing him to guide the people of Jugdral to defeat Loptyr for good. Agreeing, Forseti aided the Crusaders' descendants, leading to the death of Julius, Loptyr's final vessel. With all of that out of the way, we've finally finished talking about the first 5 games. Let's move on to Aleb's dragons. In the distant past, the dragon tribes of Aleb and the humans lived in peace. Eventually, some event would end up triggering a war, which would come to be known as the Scouring. The dragon tribes allied against mankind, save for the divine dragons, who remained neutral. The tribes easily overpowered the humans, but despite that, humanity had the upper hand in the war. This was due to their ability to reproduce quickly. While dragons could win individual battles, humanity's sheer persistence was slowly winning them the war. In an attempt to turn the tides, the tribes pleaded that one of the divine dragons join them. If a divine dragon were to become a demon dragon, they would be able to spawn war dragons, which could turn the tide. War dragons are a type of dragon created asexually, and can be produced at a much higher rate than the normal dragon's reproduction methods. Refusing this, the divine dragons fled to the Nabatean desert, though a young girl named Ithune was left behind. The dragon tribes took her and forcibly turned her into a demon dragon, forcing her to create endless war dragons. Gaining the upper hand, the dragons began overtaking humanity. That was until the forging of the 8 legendary weapons. Utilizing their power, humanity held out against their enemies. Through their use, these weapons created an imbalance in the world, which resulted in an endless winter. Unable to bear the sudden change, the dragons were forced to seal their power away in dragon stones to survive. Taking advantage of this weakness, humanity slaughtered the dragons, making their way to the temple where Ithune resided. Having killed her kin, she had no orders to create more dragons, and seeing the sadness in her eyes, the humans' leader Hartmut decided to spare her, sealing her with the Binding Blade. Doing so, he accidentally sealed Jean, a survivor from the prior battle. Those not present at this battle fled through the Dragon's Gate, leaving only the divine dragons of Nabatean in Alib. An age later, the Dragon Gate would be briefly opened and then resealed as Nurgle attempted to gain control of the dragons. After another generation, Zephiel unsealed Jean and Ithune, allying with them. In the end, Jean is defeated and Ithune is brought to Nabatean to recover. In contrast to all this, very little is known about the dragons of FE8. There are only 2 living in Magval, those being Mur and her adoptive father Morva. The 2 of them are Manicheets with dragonstones, but the only other dragons we see are Draco zombies. There is plenty of speculation that could be made here, but I'll save it for part 2. Moving on to FE9 and 10, we have an even greater change in the dragons. Unlike the others talked about up to this point, the dragons of Tellius are one of the laguz tribes. They don't require stones to transform either, being able to do so naturally. Comparatively, the dragon laguz are much more mundane than the other dragons in the series. They reside in Goldoa and are fairly isolationist. Skipping over FE11 and 12 as their remakes, we get to Awakening. Again, taking place in Aranea, we continue the story of Fornius' creation, Grima. Similar to what happened with Loptyr, Grima assumably forged a gesh with a human, leading an attack on the people of Aranea. Naga granted her blood to a human, allowing the first exile to take up the falchion and seal Grima away. 1,000 years later, in another plot similar to Manfroy's, Robin is born as a vessel for Grima with pure blood. After some time travel shenanigans, Grima is ultimately revived and defeated. Ignoring the quality in writing for Fates' story, the dragons are quite interesting. In the distant past, there existed 12 ancient dragons, including the Rainbow Sage and Anankos, among other unnamed dragons. These 12 dragons warred with each other, and at a stalemate, the Rainbow Sage forged the 5 legendary weapons, Yato, Rajinto, Fujinumi, Brynhildr, and Siegfried. The Dawn and Dusk dragons ended up entering blood pacts with the ancestors of the Hoshidan and Norian royals respectively, allowing their bodies to die. They did this in order to escape degeneration. The Rainbow Sage and assumably Moro took on the form of Manicheets to avoid this fate. Anankos, however, continued to rule over the land of Vala. While he too made a blood pact with the king of Vala, he refused to give up his body, causing him to succumb to degeneration. Eventually, unable to control himself, he lashed out at the Valite people, causing them to retaliate. Seeing their perceived betrayal, Anankos retreated and allowed his hatred to build. At this point, Anankos split his soul, allowing his sane half to plot the downfall of his degenerated half. Following this, he spawned Lilith from himself. For the explanation on this, we need only look at his Japanese title. In English, he is referred to as the Silent Dragon, but in Japanese, he's the Invisible Demon Dragon. This makes a lot more sense with that context, making Lilith a war dragon by technicality. It also implies that Anankos, along with the other ancient dragons, are assumably divine dragons. Anyway, the fragment of Anankos meanwhile took form and wandered Vala, eventually meeting Mikoto and siring Corrin. Following this, Anankos remembered his mission to defeat his other half, and so he time-traveled to the future in Elise. Yes, this is canon. There, he recruited Owain, Inigo, and Sevra, forming a pact with them and bringing them back to Vala with him. After a skirmish with Lilith, the 3 of them were sent to Nor to locate Corrin. Evil Anankos, on the other hand, ends up forming a pact with Garen in All Routes, and again with Takami in Conquest. In Revelations, he forges one with Guntur instead. Of course, Revelations is the only route in which Anankos is defeated. That mess out of the way, we can finally move on to 3 houses. Sothis is a divine dragon, arrived in Fodlan from some far-off place that is never specified. Here, she spawned the Nabateans from her blood. It's not entirely clear if this was intended to be something similar to the war dragons, or maybe something more like Grima, but regardless, they would go on to become something akin to Manichetes. Based on what we know about the crest stones, they may be dragon stones that were created internally instead of externally, but that's just a theory. Anyway, among the many Manichetes created by Sothis were the 4 saints and Seiros. Just like Thebes and Aranea, Sothis ushered in a golden age for technology for the people of Fodlan. The Agarthans took Sothis' gifts, and with their hubris tried to take control of the world. Rather than inventing necromancy given the chance like in Thebes, humanity built nukes this time. After a bloody war, Fodlan was left in ruins, and Sothis used all of her power to restore it, resting in the Holy Tomb afterwards. Following the destruction of Agartha, a few survivors retreated underground, plotting their revenge against Sothis. Sometime after this, those who slither in the dark had Nemesis break into the goddess's tomb and kill her, taking her heart, the crest of flames, drinking her blood, and using her bones to forge weapons. Nemesis effectively forged an inverse blood pact with the goddess. He would go on to massacre the people of Nabatea, taking their hearts and blood to bestow crests upon the other 10 elites. Seiros and the 2B4 saints survived the event, allying with humans to form the Adrestian Empire and fight against those who slither in the dark, Nemesis, and the 10 elites. They formed pacts with the people there, granting them crests. After a long war, the elites were finally defeated. The descendants of the 10 elites would go on to become the nobility of the future generations. Meanwhile, with the Creststone of Flames back, Rhea began experimenting to revive her mother. This culminates in Byleth having the stone implanted in them. With Sothis' spirit resting within the Crest of Flames, Byleth was able to forge a Gesh with her to escape the spell of Zahra. Going back to the Saints, 2 of them are Seteth and Flayn, them being Manichetes from Nabatea who lost their ability to transform after many years. The inverse is true for Machiel and Indek, having lost the ability to revert to their human forms. Indek seems to be fine when it comes to combating degeneration though, as he doesn't show any signs of losing his mind. That said, it has only been about 1,000 years. Machiel may be starting to degenerate though, considering his attitude towards Seteth and Byleth, but it's impossible to confirm either way. The most interesting member of this group though is Rhea herself. Unlike the others, she is seen to often change between her human form and the form of the Immaculate One. Rhea shows clear signs of degeneration, especially in Silver Snow. This culminates in you having to kill her at the end of that route. What's notable about this is the white beasts she employs. These are all high-ranking members of the church who entered blood pacts with Rhea unknowingly. Having them transform with her degeneration is certainly interesting. Anyway, all that said, we finally reached the newest game in the series, Engage. Engage's dragons seem to work pretty differently from the rest of the series. Sombron arrived in Elios from another world after the death of his family. After losing the Emblem of Foundations, he decided to collect the other Emblem rings and bring them back through the gate to his homeworld to get revenge on the people who killed his parents. He amassed an army and allied himself with some of Elios' dragon tribes, most notably with Zephyia, who was stated to be a mage dragon. Sombron had many children with a number of wives, using these children in his army. One of these children, Elir, ends up meeting the divine dragon Lumeria and defecting from Sombron's army. Sometime after this, Elir and Lumeria were able to seal Sombron away. In the process, Elir is wounded and entered a 1,000-year slumber to recover. At the end of Engage, Sombron is defeated. A small detail I wanted to mention regarding them is their ears. In most games, the dragons all have pointed ears in their Manichetes forms. In Engage, however, some of the dragons, such as Zephyia and Sombron, do have pointed ears, while some like Lumeria, Elir, and Vale do not. We'll talk about this more in part 2. That pretty much covers all the dragons in the series though. I did intentionally exclude the party member Manichetes such as Tiki and Fa, since they're pretty much too young to have an impact on the history. That said, we have reached the end of this video. With all the information compiled, I intend to explain what I believe the Fire Emblem timeline to be. If that sounds interesting to you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. Also, if I've missed any key details here, please make sure to let me know in the comments section below. I'd like to make sure all my information is as accurate as possible. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.